Hello, and welcome to the first reader mail session in a while, the last before election 2020. What a year it has been. What a 4 years it has been. Thank you to everybody who wrote in. Thank you to everybody who has read my work at The Atlantic, read the books, followed me on Twitter over these past years. Writing is a solitary activity, but it's also an interactive activity. You write with an audience in mind. And I have so many people whom I have met um, indirectly through writing in mind as I write. I thank you for your support and attention. I thank you for the corrections when I make a mistake. Um, and I thank you for the creation of a kind of virtual community in which we take part, a community, I hope, of values and of care. And I really, um, I feel as I work alone, usually in this room, that I'm writing to and for an audience of people. I feel the presence of people, and I am grateful to all of you. And thank you for the questions. They bring it home. So let me get into these questions. They are fantastic questions. I will do my best to answer them as best I can. And then at the end, I have a couple of remarks about things that have been on my mind from things I've read that I want to address. But I'll do the mail first, and then my more general comments next. Reader Andrew P. writes to ask, if Biden wins, will he restore all of the broken guardrails of democracy? Or are some of our protections, norm, conventions gone permanently? Well, that is a powerful and haunting question. I mean, there are just many things that were unthinkable that just aren't unthinkable anymore. You can think them, and anything that can be thought can is at risk of being done. I think some of the response of the Biden era, or the era that's coming, an era of broader reform, I think, will be to convert things that were unwritten understandings into formal rules. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about some proposals that Adam Schiff had in the House of Representatives that would formalize certain things into law that weren't law before. Like, for example, the rules of the Hatch Act, which forbid federal employees to take part in politics. Historically, since the act was passed in the 1940s, for people who work directly with and for the president, enforcement as a matter of courtesy has been left to the president. So when there was an investigation into Kellyanne Conway's violations of the Hatch Act, the investigation concluded that she had indeed violated the Hatch Act seriously and on numerous occasions, and then recommended to the president that he take appropriate action, that is, ask her to resign. The president didn't do that. The president himself is a leading Hatch Act violator, although there are some limits as to how far the Hatch Act applies to the president and the vice president personally. But when the president does political activity from the White House, even if the president is allowed to break the Hatch Act that way, the people who are organizing the event certainly aren't. But enforcement is up to him, and he's not done it. So Adam Schiff's law would regularize that and put some say, you know what, no more courtesy. The president, the vice president are maybe personally exempt, but everyone around them has to obey the law and faces the same penalties for not breaking the law as an employee at the Pentagon or the Department of Agriculture. I think we have also seen the president massively defy subpoenas by Congress. And what we've discovered is that there's not a lot Congress can do about it if a president decides, I'm just not complying. Most of the enforcement mechanisms are out of date. The most powerful of the enforcement mechanisms is that Congress asks the Department of Justice to go prosecute somebody for defying Congress, which is going to be hard to do when, say, it's the Attorney General who is defying Congress. So again, the Schiff laws would put some teeth in the subpoena power and have some self-executing sanctions for executive branch officials who defy congressional subpoenas. We'll have to put in writing the rules about disclosure, bring those rules into the modern era, bring rules about publishing tax records into the modern era. And I think we're going to need to extend that to some members of the president's family. One way to think about it would be to say anyone who accepts Secret Service protection must disclose their tax returns. And that would have applied to the president's children because they have actually not only accepted, but massively abused Secret Service protection, even drawn Secret Service people after them to stay at Trump properties. It's not just the president who is putting money into the Trump organization pocket by bringing the Secret Service to stay at Trump properties, but his adult children as well. And yet there are some consequences here. There are advantages to having things not be written down. The law is kind of a crude instrument and has a lot of unintended consequences. And maybe one of the most important of those consequences is Americans are very legalistic people and tend to believe that once you have a law between legal and illegal, everything on the legal side of it is therefore permissible. There's no gray zone. There's not a sense of, well, I could get away with it. I'm not going to be punished, but I still shouldn't do it. Americans do tend to play right up to the law, and the political system plays right up to the law. So the more law there is, the more dubiously ethical activities that can happen with the defense. Hey, I didn't break any law when I did that. We are going to move, as we consistently do, from a more honor-bound system to a more rule-bound system, from a system governed by norms to one governed by laws, and there will be losses there. On the other hand, the hope is that if election 2020 delivers a convincing enough repudiation of the Trump record, then many people, anyone in the future is thinking of doing something, will think, well, that sounds like something Donald Trump did. And remember what happened to him. So that's another, when you deliver your verdict on the Trump presidency, you're acting not just to do justice backwards to Donald Trump, but to send a warning forward to anyone in the future who might ever be tempted to do Trump-like things again. Reader Jeffrey G. from Toronto asks, does Congress have the authority to pass laws and regulations regarding federal elections? I'll skip, he gives some examples. Are you aware of any other country where federal elections are not run by the federal government uniformly across the entire country? I know in Canada that federal elections are run by federal law, and there's a federal agency that operates those elections. I think that's true in Germany as well. I don't know about Australia. I assume so. It is a shaming thing that Mexico has a much more sophisticated and modern voting system than does the United States. There have been some weird benefits to the chaos of American elections. In 2016, apparently, Russian operatives tried to hack into American voting systems and gave up because they were defeated by how many of them there were, how localized they were, and how, frankly, antiquated so many of them were. I mean, the system was protected by its own stupidity. But does Congress have the authority to do this? I'm not an expert, but my guess is, yeah. I mean, the 15th Amendment says that Congress has the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the 15th Amendment's ban on voting discrimination by race. The 14th Amendment gives Congress ample powers to protect equal benefit of laws to all citizens and the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. So I think if Congress wanted to, it could pass. I mean, it was allowed to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and periodically refresh that act. And I think we see from the Trump era that we are due for a new iteration of a Voting Rights Act. Important sections of the Voting Rights Act were struck down in 2013. What the court did there was not crazy. What the court said was the Voting Rights Act of 65 and its later iterations said that if you were a jurisdiction that had a history of bad voting practices, you had to pre-clear future changes in your voting laws with the Department of Justice. The Supreme Court said in 2013, that's irrational because how you behaved before 1965 is not a predictor of how you're going to behave in 2013. By the way, that was true. I mean, one of the places that did not have to pre-clear was the state of Wisconsin, which in 1965 was a very good actor on voting rights, but in the 2010s has been a very, very bad actor, maybe the very worst actor, along with North Carolina. And pre-clearance didn't protect citizens of Wisconsin at all from having their voting rights abused. So I think maybe the time has come for a set of national standards, a new Voting Rights Act that applies equally to every state and county in the country, and that inscribes into it a statutory right to vote. It's weird. The Constitution in 4 different places references the right to vote by race, by sex, by age, by poll tax. And of course, the original text of the Constitution back in 1787 said that the requirement of for someone to vote for Congress must be the same as the requirement to vote for the more numerous branch of the state legislature. But while there are these rules against restricting the right to vote, there's no statement in federal constitutional law of what that right to vote is or whether it even exists. I think it's time to put something like that on the table. I mean, you hear it more and more often said these days by some conservatives that the United States is a republic, not a democracy. I think most Americans thought it was a democracy, but if it's not, it should be. It's time. Let's create some democratic rights, and that is going to be to the benefit of all persuasions in American politics. Because right now, parties, the Republican Party right now, but in the past, at different times, and as late as the 1990s, the Democratic Party have benefited by gerrymandering, by raising difficulties to vote. Send a message to both parties. You compete by arguing that your policies are good for more people than the other party's policies will be. But we're going to remove from you the option of competing by making it difficult for people to vote, or by preventing classes and categories of people from voting at all. Take that off the table the way other democracies do. And although some people think that somehow this will jeopardize property rights or other kinds of important freedoms, I think the record is that countries that have shown that have 70% of the population voting do a very good job of defending those rights. I don't think anybody feels that property rights in Australia are insecure, even though Australia has actually laws requiring everyone to vote. And meanwhile, here in the United States, until very recently, southern states prevented not only Black people, but most white people from voting. When you look at voter turnout in elections in South Carolina and Georgia before the Civil Rights era, I mean, the majority of white people didn't vote either. It wasn't just the Black population. And in those states, life and liberty were not secure. That the states that have historically done the worst job of protecting voting rights have also done the worst job of protecting human life against mob violence and property against destruction and seizure. So I think the record in this country is that while it might be theoretically possible that there are states in which democracy and liberty are somehow in conflict, in the American context, where democracy has been insecure, liberty has been insecure. And that's the story of the southern states, obviously in the era of slavery, but including in the era of Jim Crow, into the civil rights era and after. So I think, to paraphrase a line, I forget who wrote the line, socialism or barbarism. That's not true. Socialism is barbarism, but I think in the American context, it really is true. It's democracy or barbarism. When you violate democratic rights, you violate property rights, you violate rights of due process, you violate the security of the person. When more people vote, those rights are minority rights, individual rights are more secure, not less secure. There has not been, in the American context, a trade-off between those things. Reader Joe Alexander asks, in Trumpocalypse, you support statehood for DC to correct some of the imbalance in the Senate. What about statehood for Puerto Rico? What about increasing the size of the House? Capping the size of the House at 435 makes the imbalance progressively worse. The House of Commons has 650 members. He's referring to the British House of Commons on a population of 66 million. Wouldn't it make sense to increase the size of the House to something like 650, with the bulk of the additional seats going to the most populous states? That would reduce the outsized influence of small rural states in the Electoral College. It would also force the GOP to broaden its appeal by moderating its hard right ideology. So some good points. I think the idea of expanding the House is probably at this point a good idea, and it would have the effects on the Electoral College that you mentioned. It would also make the job of constituent service less challenging for members of Congress. That's become such an important part of their work. And as the districts get bigger in population terms, that work gets harder. I am worried about statehood for Puerto Rico for this reason. And I'm influenced here by memories of the Quebec problem inside Canada. You want to have states of the United States be really committed to the United States. If there were a referendum in which Puerto Rico voted 75, 80% for statehood, then I would think, yes, statehood for Puerto Rico. But when it's 52, 55% with a substantial minority hankering for independence, I think that's just not a big enough majority to assure the rest of the country that Puerto Rican statehood will be stable. In DC, we're all in favor of it, but in Puerto Rico, there are important parts of opinion that like the status quo, Commonwealth status, and there are important parts that favor independence. So until you have not just a majority, but a consensus for statehood, I think you could be buying yourself some trouble in the future. There's some technical problems with DC statehood too. The 23rd Amendment grants the federal district 3 electoral votes, and something would have to be done to adjust that if you turn the residential areas of DC into a state. I don't have a solution ready to hand. I think it should be possible for people of goodwill to devise one. But as part of a network of voting reforms, I think DC statehood, yes, and Puerto Rican statehood on the basis of a strong show of consensus inside Puerto Rico in favor of it, but not on the basis of a majority only. Reader Christian S. argues, your final chapter, and he's referring to the book Trumpocalypse, your final chapter arguing against revenge was particularly poignant. And as the end of Trump's presidency may now be upon us, I found myself mulling it over quite a bit. Where I must regrettably push back, as I would desperately love to be wrong, is our ability to reassimilate Trumpers back into a normal functioning political system. This gets a little bit long here, but so I will skip over something. Suppose Biden wins. What happens in the course of his victory speech when, upon the first mention of Trump's name, his supporters begin to boo? Standard procedure here is for the candidate to hold up his hands, silence his supporters, and offer a brief tribute to his opponent's humanity, patriotism, and service. But truthfully, I don't know if we should do anything like that to further normalize a man after what we have seen over the past 4 years. And as you have said, he is a man bereft of any redeeming qualities. Having been a presidential speechwriter, how would you advise Biden to proceed? So those are two questions, one about Trump and one about his supporters. So on the specific, when President Trump, when should it be a Biden victory? When Vice President Biden says, I've received a call from President Trump in that unlikely hypothetical event, because he probably won't, but if he has to say it and the booing starts, I think what Biden would say is to hold up his hands and not pay a tribute to Trump, but to say, as for President Trump, he is now in the hands of the law like any other citizen and on the same equal terms. And this is not a night for that kind of sentiment. You don't have to pay any kind of tribute to him. He certainly doesn't deserve it. And in fact, his outrageous behavior toward the Biden family, I think, guarantees that Biden, who can be sentimental, can say maybe sometimes too much, I think he will be immunized against that risk. But the Trump supporters, well, let's remember that not everyone who votes for Trump is going to be part of the Trump base. Many people are supporting Trump because of negative partisanship, because he seems like the lesser evil, because they've always cast a Republican vote. And it's always worth to keep in mind that many, many people are not following political events all that closely. They have a vague impression of Trump as a loudmouth and a blowhard, but they're not current with all of the many scandals and crimes and outrages of the Trump presidency. But there is a hardcore, and they are radical in their rejection of the American political system. And I think that the way you deal with them is you have to knit together as much of the polity as you can. And I think the way I think about this, and I wrote this in the first of the two Trump books on Trumpocracy. It's a little bit like the problem that the Italians and French had in the immediate post-war period with their communist supporters. They had a considerable part of their population who were committed communists, who were loyal to Moscow, who took orders from a foreign adversary committed to a dictatorial ideology. And they won them back for democracy and small r republicanism by finding ways to deal with the real grievances on which the communists battened, and to pull away parts of the communist vote for more democratic alternatives, and then to isolate them and have a rule that those people could not be allowed into the political system. And they could not be allowed to wield power. And in fact, the British Labour Party had a practice of keeping registers of people who participated in communist activities, and they were not allowed to be in the Labour Party, and they certainly weren't allowed to hold power in Labour Party internal government. The breakdown of that system was what allowed the Corbyn fiasco to happen. But I think you can't do it so formally in the United States, but a future Republican Party will want to be aware of who in the Trump world has been involved with QAnon, who has been an outspoken white supremacist, who has taken part in extremist politics, and to try to, for its own good, protect the party from them. So you want to woo soft supporters. You want to listen. You want to listen for the real grievances that Trump spoke about. This is one of the reasons I write so much about immigration. I think that is a real issue that no one else would address, and Trump did. And that the United States and other democracies have been over permissive in their immigration. That has been a major stoker of the extremist politics we've had since the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, in all the developed countries. But after wooing as many as you can, you need to keep an eye out and stop the safaris to the Trump diners. That not every crazy thing that everybody says needs to be heated, addressed, or appeased. Reader in Oakville, Ontario, remarks that the United States is not a center-right country, but a right country. Democrats, the American Democrats, are to the right of most left parties in other Western countries, while Republicans are right of most major right-of-center parties in the above. Obviously, this is a generalization, and honest people can quibble about specifics. But my question is, why is U.S. politics significantly to the right of its comparable Western liberal democracies? And with some examples. So I think part of this is obviously it's driven by a couple of things. Part of it is an artifact of the American political system. Back there was a time when I used to make the point that if the United States and Canada had the same voting systems through the 1980s, that the United States would have been governed not by President Donald Trump, God forgive me for that, not by President Ronald Reagan, but by Prime Minister Tip O'Neill. So that's one of the differences. It's just the presidential. And by the way, if Canada had had a presidential system, it would have tended to elect more conservative presidents than it did, because the English-speaking provinces would have outvoted, if there'd been anything like the Electoral College, that the English-speaking provinces would have elected English-speaking leaders, not bilingual leaders. So there's an artifact of there's an artifact of the voting process. I think there's also the legacy of the South and Southern slavery. I sometimes think of North American politics as being really three political systems: Quebec, the South, and everything else in between. And Ontario and Michigan are not so very different, but Ontario is in a union with Quebec, and Michigan is in a union with Alabama, and that's changed the politics. The racial dynamic is obviously so important to understanding American politics. But my view is that in the 21st century, the United States has tended to converge upon the others, and that America, I delivered a lecture on this in Germany before COVID, and I don't think I ever published it. I think I should, about how American exceptionalism is a decliningly descriptive idea. In area after area, Americans are more like Germans and Canadians and Australians and Scandinavians than they used to be. And a lot of the difference is maintained by the anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian elements of the American political system. And as the American political system, if and as it becomes more representative, American politics will look more like politics elsewhere in the developed world. And by the way, politics in the rest of the developed world look more like politics in the United States. I mean, there are no more communist parties in France and Italy. There isn't any, and socialism is gone. I mean, there are social democratic parties, but they're not socialist. They are private. They are social market economies, social market parties, I mean to say, and that since 2008, since the Great Recession, that kind of consensus is less strong than it was in the 1990s, and it's challenged by new populist parties of the right as well as by socialist parties of the left. I think the politics across the developed world has more and more of a family resemblance, and the United States is marked apart by its institutions, and especially by the poor representation of its institutions. Reader Ronald B. asks, is there any hope for the future for moderate conservative Republicans who believe in social equality and fiscal conservatism? There better be, and let's ensure that it does. An article I hope to write for The Atlantic after the election, if the result allows, is to talk about how this defeat is an opportunity for a new, revamped, reformed Republican Party to become a party of service to the country, and to speak up for private enterprise and private property and markets and low taxes and moderate regulation, to learn that what Trump did was profoundly illegitimate and also destructive to their own hopes. So let's hope for it. But I think it's not enough to hope. I think it's to act. One of the themes that people who listen to me talk now, I talk again and again about, is not making predictions, but because predictions treat the future as a thing that exists, you have to make the future. It's up to you. But I think this is something that is in our hands to do, and I hope to be a useful part of it myself, if God gives me life and health. A reader who asked not to use the name wrote, I'd like to hear your analysis of why support from women is drastically declining, that is, support for Republican and conservative politics. Well, it may appear obvious on the surface, such as a reaction to Trump's narcissistic behaviors. Do you have any deeper thoughts that perhaps delve into the differences between how women and men think and behave? If at all possible, I'd also love to have your wife weigh in on this. I just saw that last sentence. I'm sorry, I didn't notice in the email before, so I didn't ask Danielle what she thinks. I mean, it really is interesting to me. I mean, my wife, who, when got married a long time ago now, was very conservative in her politics, as she has become much less so. And of course, our daughters are much less so. Um, and um, so I'll let her speak for herself. And I should have asked her before this, before I sat down with these questions. But I do think there's something about this that is there's much about this that is very obvious and understandable. There's something about this that is worrying. When you see a gender gap as big as the one that is around Donald Trump, it's both a question both about women's politics and about men's politics. Not why do women. I don't think the question should be why do women oppose, but why do men support? Because the support for Donald Trump is the aberrant position that needs to be explained. It's the men here who are acting like the weirdos, not the women. But there is something I think that can be traced to the way that men and women decreasingly live together. That there's something about living with a wife or husband. Um, the two of you do have to interact and engage and take seriously each other's views. As men and women live more and more apart, especially as young men and women live more and more apart, there's just more possibility for not only misunderstanding but for mutual resentment. I mean, that every marriage that doesn't happen is a man and a woman. In most cases, not only men and women who marry, of course, but predominantly, is a man and a woman who's living a life that is somehow separating them from really intimate knowledge and sympathy with the requirements and needs of the other sex. So I worry about this a lot, both as a parent and as a citizen. I think if there are more marriage, we'd also have more stable politics, and we need to think about both the cultural and the economic reasons why those marriages aren't happening. I think one of the less productive aspects of modern politics is the determination of conservatives to look at cultural trends and seek only cultural explanations and never economic ones. By the way, liberals make the opposite mistake. They look only at the economic uh, explanations and not the cultural, but both are true. I remember writing a review of Charles Murray's book about the state of white America. And he talked about the decline of marriage and work and all these things that conservatives rightly deplore. And he then refused to consider any economic explanations for it. And I thought I wrote in the review that it was like somebody coming upon the aftermath of a hurricane and seeing all these people living in tents and then scolding them for how much better it is for families and for children to live in houses rather than tents. And when people point out, well, a hurricane just passed through here and destroyed all the houses. That's why they're living in tents. So the person, the social critic, would magisterially raise his hand and say, "Hey, I'm talking about housing here, not weather." There's a reason that they are living in tents, and there's a reason that young men and young women are not finding each other. It's both economic and cultural, and it separates them from one another and makes the men vulnerable to politics of resentment. And as men's position in society becomes more uncertain, as historic advantages and privileges that men have come under question, that some have been attracted to this kind of reactionary politics of male grievance. And I think Trump is as much or more a candidate of male grievance as he is a candidate of white grievance. And I think women see through that, and that's one of the reasons that he's doing so badly with women and Republicans in general are. But I should have asked Danielle. I'm sorry I didn't see that last sentence. It would be interesting. Maybe she can talk about it on her podcast, The Time Explainers. So let me take up two matters beyond these questions that I've been thinking about or that I've seen people writing about, and that are questions on my mind. And I don't do well with these monologues, but I will. So forgive me if I stumble or stammer as I try to deal with them. One of them is a question that was put to me by a friend on a Zoom call, two-way Zoom call a few days ago, which is, what did I think about Twitter's intervention to try to prevent some of the more flamboyant media from circulating exaggerations or uncorroborated stories about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden? Was that a right place for social media to be? And indeed, it raised a very hard question. Twitter, of course, locked up the account of the New York Post because the New York Post had this weird story that the author would not sign, trying to put into circulation the Giuliani and Bannon claims about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. Those claims, I mean, the parts about Hunter Biden, a lot of them are pretty notorious. I mean, Hunter Biden follows in the sad tradition of Billy Carter and Hugh Rodham and Roger Clinton and Neil Bush and many other troubled members of presidential families who then try to make a living by playing on the family name. And it's usually a squalid but not super important part of American life. The Trump campaign has been to argue that Hunter Biden is at the center of some mass global billion-dollar criminal conspiracy by Joe Biden, which is pretty hilarious because, in fact, it is Donald Trump's children who are doing what Donald Trump accuses Joe Biden's children of doing. Without going into the specifics of that absurd and crazy and much exaggerated story, why is it that social media are the people who are trying to police the integrity of media, who voted for Facebook and Twitter to do this? And it's a real concern, I have to say. And I don't have a good answer to offer. I think the problem is that, and I would turn the question around. I don't think any of us quite know what to do in a media environment where there are incredibly powerful and influential media companies that exist to fabricate untruth and to put paranoid conspiracies into public life. And so when you what is Twitter? The question, what is Facebook and Twitter to do with the deliberate falsehoods promulgated by the New York Post and Fox News? That's not a Facebook Twitter problem. That's a New York Post and Fox News problem. I mean, we don't know what to do when we have major media companies that have no internal ethics, no commitment to truth, that exists as tools of political propaganda within a media ecosystem where a lot of the time they have to be treated as if they're normal news reporting, opinion disseminating organizations. What do we do about that? And it's not sustainable that the job of upholding some standards of truthfulness fall on these companies. I mean, Twitter just seems hapless. Facebook seems kind of complicit or worse. But even if Facebook were governed by the nicest people in the world, which it's not, I think it would find the problems overwhelming. And not just, by the way, in the American political context. Is Facebook going to deal with Sri Lanka? Is Facebook going to deal with the integrity of politics in Australia and South Africa? Because those platforms are abused in those places too. It's a media problem. It's got to do, I think, with the possibilities of new technologies. A long time ago, when I was starting, when people in media were trying to put out crazy stuff, the crazy stuff would look crazy. It would be posted on mimeograph. It would look physically different from the more quality product. That's just not true anymore, and we're all a little baffled. I've said in the past that some of the responsibility falls on the individual user. To be a responsible user, to remember that we are not only consumers of social media, but we are ourselves publishers. We are ourselves disseminators of information. But that's an important aspiration that we should all try to live up to. But that's maybe not workable either. I don't have a good answer to this, but we need to keep our eye on what the problem is. The problem is not the behavior of social media platforms. The problem is the behavior of Fox, the New York Post, Breitbart, and companies like that. And when we're trying to think, what do we do? It's what do we do about them, not what do we do about the social media companies. That should be the question uppermost in mind. The second thing that's been on my mind is a very interesting column that my friend Ross Douthat wrote in the New York Times about this joke, or this by now well-worn joke that you see on Twitter and other social media platforms about the 2020 and the writer's room, or 2020 and the authors. And Ross wrote, as someone who does believe that history has an author, that he found it sort of misplaced religion, that these people were groping for the idea of who are the authors of the year 2020. And yeah, and I think he's right that behind that well-worn joke is the search for some kind of meaning and purpose in history, for some kind of narrative coherence to the universe that isn't there. And I want to think, and Ross made this as a way to score a religious point off non-religious people. As someone who is religious, maybe not as religious as Ross, but certainly believes in a creator and an author, I want to say something about this, which is God put 14 trillion years of development into the production of the human mind, from the Big Bang till now. 4.5 billion years from the creation of our solar system to now. All of it with the result that here we are with the intelligences that we have. And I think he sort of left it to us. I mean, it's not fair to blame. He did his part. He did his part. He created the most this incredible thinking machine that is the human brain. And then he said, go solve your own problems. That's why I gave you a mind and a soul. And I think then when you, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I find it so disturbing when religious people then countenance the kinds of things that Donald Trump is doing in the name of religion. The whole point of giving you the moral and intellectual equipment that you have was so that you could make better choices. You're responsible, and you can't don't put this on God. Uh, I sometimes imagine, I mean, if you're any kind of believer in God and you take seriously the idea of omniscience and omnipotence and one God for the whole, not only galaxy but the whole universe, we must look awfully puny to him, and our attempts to understand God must look pretty inadequate. So you can't fob the blame for the bad things that you want to do on the demands of some remote supernatural being. If you want to do bad things, it's because you want to do them. There's a Jewish midrash, a religious story that sort of I think about a lot, which is a rabbi comes upon a group of disciples who are fiercely praying, and the rabbi asks the disciples, "Well, what are you praying so hard for?" And they're saying they reply to him that we are praying that the evil inclination, the spirit of temptation, will not pursue us. And the rabbi tells them, "Don't flatter yourself. It is not pursuing you. You are pursuing it." It is an amazing thing to me that people can read religious books which contain both things that are inspiring and things that are pretty appalling, and that choose to fasten on the appalling parts, choose to use a religious book as a justification for burning witches or persecuting people or murdering people or being unkind. Um, it's an ink blot test. What you bring to the book is what is in you, and believers who find in belief a justification for wrong are revealing nothing about the belief. They're revealing a lot about the believer. Um, Thank you. Thanks for the attention. Thanks for the readership. Thanks for your questions. Um, if you are a believer, if you're any kind of praying person, I hope you'll pray for the United States and pray for a safe and good outcome, and pray for wisdom, pray for justice, pray for peace. And I look forward to talking with you all more on the other side of this dramatic historical event that we're going to live through in the coming days. Thank you. Talk soon. Bye-bye.